Welcome back everybody to our studies in Edexcel A-Level History. This video is going to spend some time talking about the new power structure in China, essentially thinking about the CCP, looking at the different roles of the CCP, the government, the bureaucracy, looking at the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, and then thinking about two broad concepts towards the end of this video. Talking firstly about the idea of Mao as having a quite dominant position within the CCP, and then thinking about the idea of democratic centralism. Two very important ideas that we will look at towards the end of this lesson. So, essentially, the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the defeat of the KMT, the nationalists within China, marks the profound transformation away from the state of China as it was to the establishment of the Chinese communist system, the People's Republic of China, under the role of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. This is the new power structure which emerges that integrates key institutions of the CCP, the party itself, the government, the bureaucracy, and the People's Liberation Army. The center of this system was, of course, Mao Zedong, who we will talk about in a second. But more broadly speaking, the CCP was the driving force behind the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the PRC. After the years of struggles, including firstly the occupation, including even before that, the Long March from 1934 to 1935, the occupation from 1937 to 1945, and then the Chinese Civil War from 1946 to 1949, we can see that the CCP begins to emerge as the supreme authority within the country. The CCP did not just have a political presence, though. They weren't just a political party in the usual sense, in the sense that in this country, for example, at time of recording, we are ran by the Labour Party. This is the political party that is in control, that is in government. But instead, the CCP was embedded in every single facet of government, of military, and of civil administration. The Communist Party had its own committees, which existed in parallel to the formal state apparatus. We can see that the key decision-making bodies within the CCP were the Central Committee and the Politburo. These bodies were tasked with the setting of the direction of policy, if you will. The Politburo Standing Committee, for example, and in particular, held the most power, and within the Politburo Standing Committee, Mao was the uncontested leader. Now, the basic principle within the CCP at this time is one that we will talk about as well later on, but it is this idea of democratic centralism. It becomes the cornerstone of CCP governance, and it essentially emphasizes the central authority of the party while allowing for limited internal discussion. So it sort of had the bravado of democracy and democratic decision-making, while also very clearly being part of the central governance of the CCP. The method was to essentially try and ensure unity within the party while still maintaining a strict top-down control. So essentially, discussions were allowed, but ultimately, this is a top-down system. And so once a decision was made, all members were expected to support it fully, and dissent would be suppressed within the party. So it is a sort of paradoxical democracy, anti-democracy dichotomy that we start to see within this idea of democratic centralism. So while the CCP was clearly the most important and most powerful organization in China, the government formed the outward-facing institution of authority. So we see, for example, the Central People's Government, the CPG. This was the framework of the People's Republic of China, and it was composed of various ministers and departments. It was designed to serve as the official authority But ultimately, decision-making power lay at the hands of the leadership within the Communist Party. So, for example, the State Council acted as the executive arm of the government, but was basically under the command of the Communist Party. Chairman Mao, chairman of the CCP, was also the chairman of the Central People's Government. So he was in control of both the party and also the CPG. This dual role gave him influence over both party and government, and his leadership was further solidified when he became the chairman of the Central Military Commission, placing him as both head of state, head of party, and head of government, all three of those things together. And so, in order to sort of suppress dissent and to maintain control from this top-down perspective, the party also wielded quite a lot of power within the bureaucracy. Under the new system, the Communist Party exerted a tight grip over the bureaucracy, using it as a tool to implement any of the policies that were needed. A policy particularly championed by Mao was known as the mass line. This essentially dictated that officials at all levels were to serve the people and were to act as a bridge between the CCP central leadership and the masses, so-called the mass line, as is described. The ideology then placed an emphasis on grassroots involvement in governance, but at the same time, it meant that the leadership within the party maintained overarching authority. We can see that the bureaucracy was not just a neutral administrative institution or apparatus that would implement policy. It was an extension of party power, just like how the CCP essentially imbues every single part of government structure. So in this country, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have our own bureaucracy, we have our own civil service that is essentially an administrative institution that forms executive functions. It forms the functions of essentially executing laws that are passed by Parliament. But it is, for the most part, a completely neutral administrative apparatus that is not infected by or influenced by any of the political parties that may or may not come in and out of power. In fact, the sort of undersecretaries of various different ministers and the sort of permanent secretaries of ministers will often go in and out of different political parties. They will often, what I mean by that is they will often serve ministers of both sides of the political aisle because they are meant to be neutral. They're meant to be unbiased. They're meant to be politically bipartisan. But the bureaucracy in the Chinese Communist state, in the People's Republic of China in 1949, was far more imbued by the apparatus of the party, and so therefore was seen as just an extension of party power. When it comes to military control, then, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, had a central role in both securing and also maintaining the power of the Communist Party. It had been instrumental as part of the Communist victory during the Chinese Civil War, and it was a key arm of the state. The PLA was not merely just a military institution, but it also served as a political institution because it was deeply integrated into the governance structure of the party. You see that military leaders, for example, would start to hold very key positions within the party and within the state apparatus. So, for example, a key PLA leader by the name of Lin Bao was not just a military commander. Lin Bao was also the vice chairman of the CCP and also a member of the Politburo. When we think about the influence of Mao in this particular conversation, his dominance within the CCP also ensured that he would be able to control through the PLA. As chairman of the Central Military Commission, Mao had the final say on military strategy, and his leadership meant that the PLA was loyal to him. And through this power and the support of Mao's authority, we can see that government was consolidated militarily as well as politically and ideologically. And so ultimately, as I've touched on, as time has gone on through this lesson, Mao has a particularly dominant position within the communist state. It was reinforced not only through his leadership in the CCP and in the military, but also by his personal ideology. We see that as time goes on, a cult of personality begins to develop. Mao starts to position himself as not only a key leader within this particular government, but also as the supreme leader. His thoughts, codified in Mao Zedong thought, became the central guiding principles for both the party and the state. The idea of Mao Zedong thought permeated not just policy, but also the educational and cultural spheres within China, giving Mao near absolute authority. And we see this absolute authority when we start to think about some of the suppression and campaigns against suppression, or campaigns in favor of suppression, should I say, in things like the 100 Flowers campaign. We see, obviously, within the Cultural Revolution, Mao's cult of personality becomes a paramount influence, and then also within his economic policies, like the Great Leap Forward, all of which are disasters for the population of China, but all of which show just how powerful his influence and his cult of personality was. This ideological supremacy then allows him to influence every aspect of Chinese life. His writings were treated almost with the kind of religious reverence. His policies were presented as a solution to the problems of China, and his leadership style was often compared to that of a father figure, the idea that he was leading the nation. And so ultimately, I want to just finish by thinking a little bit about democratic centralism, and give it a couple of examples of where this plays out. So by 1949, the idea of democratic centralism had become the central organizational and decision-making principle of the Communist Party. It was a system that was practiced in the Soviet Union to a lesser extent, and was adapted by the CCP to suit its needs. We'll talk about the influence of the Soviet Union as time goes on, because they, of course, were a key ally to the People's Republic of China for quite a lot of this early period, even though there was sort of a souring of Sino-Soviet relations as time goes on. But at least at the time, at this point in time, they were very heavily supportive. So within the party, there was limited room for some debate and discussion, and this was especially prevalent at the lower levels of authority. But that is the sort of democratic part of the phrase democratic centralism. The centralism part refers to the fact that even though there was discussion and room for some debate and discussion about policy, the ultimate authority rested formally and categorically with the central leadership. So once decisions were made at the top, they were expected to be adhered to without any kind of dissent, ensuring unity and coherence within the party's direction. In practice, then, this idea of central authority can be seen with Mao's leadership, especially after 1949, when Mao's leadership saw challenges from some other party members. But his position was solidified through a number of policies, such as the land reform movement, which targeted landowners and redistributed land to peasantry, which we'll again get to in future lessons. And ultimately, then, when we think about this evidence of practice, you could also reference the fact that the PLA was very, very important in solidifying the authority of the CCP within the Korean War. Again, something that we'll look at in a future lesson. Mao's decision to send Chinese forces to Korea demonstrated the military influence under his leadership, but it also demonstrated the centrality of democratic centralism, that he was the key figure who was at the sort of apex of political authority. And this was an influence that extended beyond formal titles, and ultimately meant that he was the principal architect of all policies from both a practical perspective, from an economic and social perspective, but also from a ideological perspective, in such a way that it bleeds into being something of a religious perspective. His policies were seen as the divine decision-making of the divine leader, almost. He is almost seen as a divine figure, owing to his cult of personality.